Hey guys, welcome to TGS. Today we're going to be covering firearms history, or firearms legal history in the UK, or within England more importantly, from 1689 all the way through to 1967. Which I would say was the start of the pre-modern era all the way through to the modern era of firearms legislation in the UK. And that all kicks off with the Bill of Rights, which many people quote is the right to bear arms within the UK. But as we will get to later on in this, that has been superseded. So, let's talk about that Bill of Rights for a second. The Bill of Rights came about after about 30 years of history, 40 years of history. That being the English Civil War. The English Civil War was not fun, fought between parliamentarians and Roundheads, which as much as it always feels like it's the people versus the king, it was actually rich parliamentarian landowner traders against the king and subsequent religious issues accordingly. We ended up with James II on the throne, I believe. He was a Catholic, and we had 25 years of the English Restoration. You know, at that point, the parliamentarians had won, a bit of a bunch of killjoys, a lot of them, and they had put in place this Catholic king to rule. It was viewed by many as not an issue, seeing as his daughter, Mary, was a Protestant. However, he had a son in 1988, some 20 odd years after, and that was an issue. So, Mary and her husband William of Orange, came over and had a bloodless revolution, the Glorious Revolution, and 1 year later, the Bill of Rights was written. This outlined two things, and it was sort of the end also of this time of human rights. It was the outlining of many thoughts, chats, and talks, and little acts from beforehand, outlining basic human rights and civil rights within the UK, also outlining who was to become king, and kind of legalising the overthrowing of the king's abdication of the throne kind of thing. It was a bit of whatever it was. It doesn't really matter. What it did lend to, though, was a massively anti-Catholic Bill of Rights. It's famously very anti-Catholic. And, well, I suppose this is part of the issue when people start quoting this as our right to bear arms in the UK, is that it's taken out of context, in that this was written some many hundreds and hundreds of years ago. Cue Americans going, it doesn't matter, Second Amendment. Like, this was written many, many hundreds of years when it was perfectly acceptable to not allow someone. It allows, very clearly, let's step back. This allows Protestants the right to bear arms, but not Catholics. Bear in mind how ridiculous this is for just 1 second. And then, bear in mind, are you actually a Protestant, and does this right to bear arms actually apply to you? I'm not going to get into a political debate. This isn't a political channel. It's not a religious channel. It's not really time to talk about that kind of thing. But bear in mind, just bear that in mind, how ridiculous carrying the Bill of Rights, right to bear arms, all the way through till 2020 is. And trying to quote that as a reason to bear arms without license or anything like that. Let's move on, shall we? Anyway, regardless, not a lot changed for a short period of time after. Yeah, we had the Jacobite rebellions in Scotland, and there was acts put in place up there, a Disarmament Act that essentially said you can't have anything if you're Scottish, and you can't. There was the Dress Act that said you can't wear anything Scottish, and it was just more of a dissolvement of all things Scottish, and actually trying to impress. Well, actually, no, the Dress Act came quite some time further on, but the Disarmament Acts came in 1716 and 1725, both trying to do it. Neither of which were really enforced, which led obviously to another revolution, a Jacobite revolution later on. But we're not here to talk about that either. But it's just to say these were minor firearms laws that were put in place to say that you couldn't own guns, swords, knives, clubs, anything if you're in Scotland, to try and quash any further rebellion or any thoughts of rebellion. And again, they came, they went. So from 1746 all the way through for quite some years, the Act of Prescription was the last firearms or weapons-related act that really did anything to do with guns in the UK. All the way through until they started implying, post-Napoleonic Wars, a whole bunch of vagrancy acts. We had a lot of soldiers wandering the streets of England, on the roads of England, as vagrants, and many of them were armed with guns. Because they brought them back, because they'd been off fighting wars in Europe, and they come back with a bunch of guns. Obviously, this was a slight point of concern for those in charge, whether that be police, military, or the government. So, they put acts in place to say that they could not have guns if you're a vagrant. And that's pretty much what it was. Most of this was actually anti-poaching laws more than anything else to stop people going and shooting game, which was becoming increasingly valuable. And then by 1831 they put in a couple more anti-poaching laws and the Game Act. And I will talk about the Game Act because, well, it's pertinent to the channel and it's interesting. And it was kind of pretty much still around up until remnants of it are still around. Let's talk about it before I divulge any more information of what parts of it's still around. So the 1831 Game Act put in place the shooting seasons that we know and love today, or at least those for pheasant and partridge and grouse in the UK. It also outlined a season for bustards, great bustards, which were pretty much wiped out about 4 years after, so that was a non-issue really for a long period of time. Capercaillie weren't covered, as well as a few other species, because they were extinct in the UK at the time, or were only introduced thereafter. It also says you could not take game without a licence, and this is pertinent because later on certain acts, instead of having a licence, you could have your game licence, and that would allow you to own firearms or be in public with firearms. So this is actually important. It also allowed, and this is I found very interesting, you needed a licence to have gamekeepers on your ground. That's pretty interesting, isn't it? So the first sort of firearms licensing, if you like, a proper firearms licence, was the Firearms Act of 1870. The Firearms Act of 1870 essentially says you can have whatever you want at home, but as soon as you step out in public, you're gonna need a gun license. And you can have it in home and in the area of your home, more importantly. But as soon as you step out your house, you need a license. This is widely viewed as just a revenue builder. This wasn't in any sort of response to gun crime or anything like that. It was just a reason to charge people a lot of money. It cost the equivalent of, well, it cost 10 shillings, which is the equivalent of about 60 quid now a year. 60 quid a year now, which is, to be fair, what firearms licenses should probably cost now, but that isn't a popular thought, but that is kind of what they should cost to make this whole system work. But that's by the by. The interesting thing is, if you were caught without a firearms license, you could get fined the equivalent of 1,200 quid now. £1,200 fine for being caught without a license. And I understand that that isn't particularly scalable, but that's a huge amount of money, considering this was just the first step. What's also interesting is you couldn't carry parts of firearms. So, for example, if you took a shotgun, I'm trying to think in 1870, yeah, you'd have shotguns that took apart. Pull the fore end off, take the barrels off, take the action stock off. Okay, you take that and you give one to you, one to your mate, one to him. Nowadays, as long as you all had firearms licenses, that wouldn't be an issue, obviously. And if you didn't, well, you're all in trouble anyway. But it was the first time, and they actually outlined that if you had one of these parts and all your mates had a part, all of you would be charged 1,200 quid. So you'd all get the fine, which is interesting, very interesting. There were, of course, in this exemptions for police and military and all sorts of other things. So you could kind of get away from it if you were going off to practice target shooting, if you were serving policemen or military, and, well, that seems logical, doesn't it? But anyway, I digress. Onwards in history. The next act that came to be was the Pistol Act of 1903. This act said you got to have a license specifically for a pistol, and it needs to be registered when you buy it from a dealer. You needed a gun license or a game license, or reasonable cause to not need either of those. For example, if you were going to stay abroad for 6 months, but you needed loads of reasons to have that, and there was a load of other caveats as well, as you can imagine any law in 1903 does, or any current law does, pertinent to the time and exemptions that people demand. The Act stated that if you were under 18, you couldn't buy pistols. Again, there were some exemptions to that, and that you had to keep records as a dealer that could be inspected at any time thereafter. And this is kind of the first sign of modern gun laws coming into play. The last bit I'll say about that act, and this is repeated a few times subsequently, but nowadays seems common sense, is that it was illegal to purchase a gun if you were intoxicated or not of sound mind, and as a seller, it was illegal to sell a gun to somebody if they were intoxicated or were not of sound mind, and there was a massive fine attached to that, as you can imagine. Today, that just seems fairly common sense. But back then, it needed to be enshrined in law that makes it today's common sense. I suppose that's the way that history works. So what happened next was probably the largest set of changes that were sort of politically and socially driven that kind of put in place the basis for gun law that we know and love today. And that, well, we start with the 1911 battle, or the Battle of Stepney. It was probably the last open gunfight that would ever happen in the UK. And this was between the Met Police and a Latvian street gang that had killed some people in a failed dual robbery. And this was literally a street battle. It was the first siege and gunfight to be caught as well on camera by British Pathé. That's quite exciting. But it was a couple of incidents like this that arose the potential issue of firearms in the hands of people who shouldn't have firearms. And as such, they decided to perhaps make it so that people who shouldn't have firearms couldn't have firearms. So that's point one. Point two was the Russian Revolution. Obviously, people have had revolutions in the past, but many of those were distant memories. The Russian Revolution was not so. It was a case of working class people rising up and taking power and essentially killing and removing everybody of aristocracy, power or worth. Either way, the revolution made all of Europe's powers sit up and listen and realise that actually if you had an angry armed populace, that could be a really bad thing. And as such, they didn't want the ability for anybody to have a gun. And at this point, it does kind of sound like I'm ranting and raving about, or it could be the start of a rant and rave about governments being tyrannical and taking people's powers away by taking away their guns. But it's also worth saying that a revolution is really not very good for anybody, and actually having a generally happy populace is better, and having a small armed contingent that would be unhappy could be bad for everybody. So this is me just offering a balanced view of history here. Gun rightists, calm down. Go have a cup of chamomile tea, please. Before I move off of this Russian Revolution point, it's worth bearing in mind that at that same time that people were thinking about this, World War I was coming to a close, and there was a large portion of the populace that was well trained with firearms, battle-hardened soldiers. And this is also another part of this, is actually that there was a lot of war trophies brought home. War trophies being brought home for years and years and years, and it's something actually deeply ingrained in the human mind to take a memento from any story to help tell that story. That's so ingrained in our brains, in our society, whether that's a war trophy or a hunting trophy or a football trophy or just a memento of a story or a victory. And that's so deep-rooted in us, I mean, that it still happens to this day. For example, Danny Nightingale in Iraq got done for having a Glock that he took off from, got given by an Iraqi. It happens. During the Argentine war in the Falklands, during the Falklands War, apparently on the way back, people were throwing pistols off the side of the boat because they were told if under no certain circumstances were they to be caught with any weapons or trophies of war at home. Guns, at least. Interesting, right? So, that was the case. There were people running around the streets, potentially armed with something like a Madsen machine gun or just a bolt-action rifle. Unregistered, unknown. And then the final point that brought around this next large thing was the fact that Britain had a lot of enemies. And some of those were domestic, and some of those were non-domestic. For example, we were still at war with Ireland back then. It was significant tensions with lots of other people, and the ability again to control who had a firearm was not a bad thing in those situations, potentially. So here is the next great step, the Firearms Act of 1920. This did not affect smoothbore guns, but rather pertained pretty much to anything rifled, anything semi-automatic, and well, just anything rifled. Smoothbores didn't count. This new form of certification that was brought around in 1920 is very much more a step towards what we have today. The licenses lasted for 3 years, and on those licenses you had to have written what you had as guns and then how much of what ammunition you were allowed. It really was the first step and the first incarnation of what we do have today. Most importantly about this 1920 Act is that it kind of overrode the Bill of Rights, and suddenly you have to have on the condition that right, you have that right on the condition of the Chief Officer of Police and the Home Secretary. So all of a sudden you can have that right removed by those in charge. For reasons that were stipulated in secret letters back in the day. Those reasons now are widely known, but back then the reasons did include self-defense, but you had to have a specific reason to own a gun. Skip forward a bit, we have 1933 Firearms and Imitation Firearms Bill. That makes it easier for police to actually sentence people and makes a much stiffer sentence for people who are abusing the gun laws of the time. And so a small skip forward in time sees us in 1937 when we see the first Firearms Act. The first Firearms Act says no fully automatic weapons. No fully automatic weapons. It also says no weapons for self-defense. It also says no barrels under 20 inches in a shotgun, and it says you can't buy a gun if you're under a certain age, except you can keep the caveats that we've mentioned before, or at least some of them. A load of restrictions were put in place, and a much more modern style of firearms licensing was born. Bearing in mind though, at this time you could still own a shotgun without a license, all the way through up until the end of this time period I'm talking about, and that is 1967, when you had to finally have a license for a shotgun. But you did not have to have it registered upon that license. It was just like a ticket that you could have, much more like earlier models. However, that only lasted a year, because in the current period, the Firearms Act of 1968, suddenly, you have a license, a shotgun license, a firearms license, and we see the modern method being born. And that brings us to the current era, which I'm not going to talk about because my head will explode, and there's so many interpretations of current and modern firearms law that I could not deal with the comments section. If you have any questions on modern firearms law, bang them below and we shall try and help. But subsequent to that, obviously, there were two amendments to that 1968 Act, one in 1888 and one in 97, one on semi-automatic firearms centerfires and one for pistols, as much as those two acts also covered a load of other stuff. And also then the VCR Act of 2006. And ta-da, we are here today. I'm not talking about modern period now, but I will do at some point in the future. P.S. For those of you who have got this far, I'm going to hark back to the Battle of Stepney. Not only was it the first gunfight siege caught on camera by British Pathé, which is interesting, it is also interesting to note that Churchill was present, and he got a mighty uproar about that because he didn't need to be present. He put himself in danger, and people did not like that. This whole thing, because they were fighting a Latvian gang at the time, brought rise to Churchill trying to bring around something called the Aliens Act, which would have been rather horrific. It was a little bit xenophobic and miserable. However, there's a letter or a quote that goes from a guy called Mr. Wedgwood to Churchill, and it goes like this. "You know as well as I do that human life does not matter a rap in comparison with the death of ideas and the betrayal of English traditions." And that was Josiah Wedgwood. It's a brilliant quote. Thank you for indulging me. Hey, I don't know if it's pertinent today, but it is interesting, and it is 110 years old, and it did crop up whilst me regimenting this whole video. Guys, thank you very much for watching. Thank you for watching to the end. Take care. Be excellent to one another once again, and we'll see you next time.